A little after 1 in the afternoon, on a warm July day in Queens, New York, police officers walked into a third-floor apartment expecting a welfare check. What they found instead was a homicide scene that would leave even seasoned detectives speechless. A 55-year-old man lying on the floor, handcuffed, gagged with a towel, sealed shut with duct tape. No pulse. And then the detail that made this case impossible to forget. The victim had been mutilated. His genitals removed. At first, investigators had no idea what they were looking at. A robbery gone wrong? A gang hit? Some kind of ritual killing? The truth, when it came out, was far stranger and far darker than anything they imagined. Because the woman who did this wasn't a stranger. She wasn't even trying to hide. She was his daughter. And what she told police that day would split a family in half, put 12 strangers on a jury in an impossible position, and raise a question that true crime audiences still argue about today. When the system fails a victim for years, what happens when that victim decides to become the system herself? If cases like this, the ones where the line between victim and perpetrator gets blurry and uncomfortable, are the ones that keep you up at night, hit subscribe now, because this story only gets more complicated from here. This is the story of Bridget Harris. On paper, July 28, 2007, was an ordinary summer day in Rockaway, Queens. Humid, a small chance of rain. The kind of day nobody remembers until something happens that makes it impossible to forget. Paramedics and police were called to a third-floor apartment. Inside, they found Eric Goodridge, a 55-year-old businessman, dead on the floor. He'd been restrained with handcuffs, gagged, and mutilated in a way investigators rarely encounter. The official cause of death wasn't the mutilation itself. It was asphyxiation. The gag had slowly cut off his air supply as he struggled. 2 notes were found at the scene. One read simply that he had ruined her life. The other said she no longer blamed herself. Within hours, police had their suspect, his own daughter, Bridget Harris, a 26-year-old security guard who worked at JFK Airport. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She called 911 herself, twice, though both times she hung up before giving details. To understand why a woman would do this to her own father, and why a jury would eventually show her mercy most murder defendants never receive, you have to go back more than 2 decades, to a childhood that reads less like a family history and more like a case study in how a system can fail a child at every single turn. Bridget Harris was born in June of 1991 in Staten Island, the youngest of 6 children born to Eric Goodridge and Lucy Ann Harris, both immigrants from Liberia. Eric ran several businesses, an import-export company, a record store, a travel agency. To the outside world, he looked like a success story, a respected member of his community. But according to Bridget, he denied being her father when she was born, and not long after, he left the family altogether for another woman. Lucy was left to raise 6 children alone. She struggled. And in 1983, when Bridget was just 2 years old, Lucy left the country to attend a funeral in Liberia, and, because of her immigration status, wasn't allowed back into the United States. 6 children. No mother. No stable father. What followed was years of bouncing between foster homes and relatives. Eventually, Bridget and her siblings landed with their father's mother and sister in Providence, Rhode Island. And according to Bridget, this is where the abuse of a different kind began. She has described a grandmother who ruled through fear and cruelty, punishments that went far beyond discipline. On one occasion, over something as small as an unflushed toilet, Bridget says she was stripped, beaten with a stick until her skin split open, and then had pepper sauce poured onto her wounds. At 12 years old, in 1994, Bridget and her siblings were finally sent to reunite with their mother, this time in Liberia. Bridget had hoped this reunion would finally give her the love and stability she'd never had. It didn't. Within weeks, she says her mother had grown distant and neglectful again. When Bridget later contracted malaria and spent 2 weeks in the hospital, her mother, she says, didn't visit. She had church commitments instead. And Liberia in the mid-90s was not a safe place to be a child without protection. The country was in the middle of a brutal civil war. Eventually, Bridget's American citizenship documents allowed her and her siblings to be airlifted back to the United States, but stability still didn't follow. More relatives, more shelters, more instability. It wasn't until 2007, at 26 years old, that Bridget finally had something that felt like her own life. Her own apartment, a job as a security guard at JFK, new friends, and, crucially, no contact with her father. That's when the story takes its darkest turn, because according to Bridget, the chaos of her childhood wasn't the worst of it. She has alleged that starting at the age of 3, her father sexually abused her, and that the abuse continued for over a decade, growing more severe as she got older. She says she eventually told her mother, who brought the allegation to a pastor in their community, and the pastor did nothing. Eric, a respected businessman, wasn't the kind of man people wanted to believe was capable of something so monstrous. So nobody acted. If you're wondering how something like this can go unreported and unpunished for over 20 years, you're not alone, and that question sits at the very center of this case. Let us know in the comments where you think the system failed her the most, because there isn't just one answer. By 2007, Bridget believed she had finally escaped her father for good. She wasn't answering his calls. She had built a life without him in it. But Eric's health was failing. He returned to the U.S. for medical treatment and moved in with one of Bridget's sisters, Carlene. And Carlene, who didn't share Bridget's certainty about who their father really was, began pushing for reconciliation. A family dinner was arranged. Eric would be there. He wanted, Carlene said, to apologize. Bridget agreed to go. It meant a 2-hour trip by subway and ferry to Staten Island. And when she arrived, what she saw confirmed every fear she'd been carrying for years. Her father was bouncing her young niece on his knee, the exact same gesture Bridget says he used with her before the abuse began each time. Then came the announcement that made everything worse. Eric wanted to take Carlene's daughter back to Liberia with him. For Bridget, this wasn't a grandfather wanting to spend time with his grandchild. This was a threat she recognized instantly. An argument broke out between the sisters. Carlene, still holding on to the idea that their father was simply an old, sick man, didn't believe he'd repeat the past. Bridget knew otherwise. She tried the legal route first. She looked into reporting her father to police for what he'd done to her as a child. But too much time had passed. The statute of limitations had expired. The system that failed to protect her as a child was now telling her, as an adult, that there was nothing it could do. So Bridget searched for another kind of solution. And that's when she came across the story of Lorena Bobbitt, the Virginia woman who, in 1993, cut off her husband's genitals after alleging years of abuse. 3 days before she was scheduled to see her father again, Bridget sat down in front of a camcorder. She recorded a message, a kind of testimony, addressed to whoever might watch it later, laying out her reasons for what she was about to do and asking to be judged only after hearing the whole story. What happened next would end a life and change hers forever. At this point in the story, if you were in Bridget's position, years of unresolved trauma, a legal system that had run out the clock, and a man you believed was about to do to a child what he'd done to you, what would you have done? Drop your honest answer in the comments, because this is where the case stops being simple. A few days after the family dinner, Bridget invited her father to her apartment. According to her later testimony, she wanted to confront him directly, to make him understand what he had done, and to demand that he abandon any plan to take her niece to Liberia. The conversation, by her account, went nowhere. When she brought up specific memories from her childhood, Eric didn't deny them outright, but he didn't take responsibility either. He questioned how she could even remember being 3 years old. He made excuses. He minimized. Bridget told him plainly. She knew what he intended to do with her niece, and she needed him to stop. This was his chance to actually make amends, not just talk about it. He denied any wrongdoing entirely. According to Bridget's account, the confrontation escalated. Eric stood and stepped toward her. She responded with pepper spray. A struggle followed, and at some point during it, Eric lost consciousness. What Bridget did next reveals a chilling amount of improvisation rather than premeditated planning, according to her defense. She found handcuffs in her apartment, bought, she said, as something of a joke gift related to her security guard job, and restrained him. When Eric began having trouble breathing, Bridget tried to revive him, splashing him with water and calling his name. He woke up and started shouting. In response, she gagged him with a towel, sealed with duct tape, leaving gaps for him to breathe. She pulled down his pants. She used scissors first, but they weren't effective, so she retrieved a set of scalpels she had ordered online roughly a month earlier. She restrained him with her knee against his throat and made the cut. She has said she was surprised by how little blood there was, knowing that doctors could potentially reattach the severed tissue if it were found intact. Bridget took it to her stove and burned it. The smell, she later said, is what snapped her back into the reality of what she'd just done. She turned off the stove, wrapped the remains in a paper towel, called 911, and hung up before giving an address or explanation. Then she packed her scalpels, pepper spray, and scissors into a backpack and left the apartment, calling police again from outside, once more hanging up before providing further information. By the time officers and paramedics reached the apartment and began CPR, it was too late. Eric Goodridge was pronounced dead at the scene. At first glance, investigators faced a genuinely strange scene. A man handcuffed and gagged in his own daughter's apartment. Genital mutilation. A scalpel left behind. It initially had the hallmarks of a violent, possibly premeditated act of revenge. But the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became. The medical examiner determined that the mutilation, however shocking, was not what killed Eric Goodridge. His death was caused by asphyxiation. The gag had gradually worked its way to block his nasal airway as he struggled against his restraints. In other words, whether Bridget intended for her father to die or only intended to restrain and punish him became a central, unresolved question of the case. The two notes found at the apartment only deepened the psychological picture investigators were building. They weren't taunts, and they weren't confessions of a cold, calculated killing. They read like fragments of years of internal conflict, self-blame, and the beginning of letting that self-blame go. When 911 dispatchers called Bridget back and asked her to come to the police station, she agreed and said she was only a block away. She never showed up. Instead, she walked past the station toward the boardwalk, where she disposed of the evidence in her backpack. She called her sister Carlene, telling her what she'd done and that she planned to turn herself in. Carlene begged her not to go alone and rushed to find her. When she did, she discovered Bridget in a daze, her hands and lap covered in blood, this time her own. Bridget had cut her wrist with a scalpel. Carlene called 911 immediately. Bridget was taken to a psychiatric ward, where she remained for 3 weeks before being formally placed under arrest. Within 36 hours of the killing, Carlene had already hired a well-known defense attorney. And in a move that surprised many, Carlene didn't try to distance the family from the crime. She went public, telling reporters that she, too, had been abused by their father as a child, starting around the age of 4 and continuing until she was nearly 18. The case had shifted. This was no longer simply a homicide investigation. It was becoming a referendum on what happens when a family's private horror finally becomes public.
The only reason I can talk about this now is because it's going to help my sister. She needs help. Myself, it started at about 4 years old till I was about 12 years old. For my sister, probably about 3 years old. Till she was going on 18. Till she was going on 18. This was
a sister breaking her silence today in a bizarre case of family revenge, a case that isn't what it seemed.
Sadly, she dealt with this for so long by herself when I was right there, and I went through the same darn thing with her and did nothing.
What the evidence is going to reveal here is that Bridget Harris was the victim of regular and systematic and by her father from the age of 3 years old right through young adulthood.
Do you think she just broke down?
We all break down. Of course you break down with something like this. We broke down a long time ago. At this point, her cries are loud and clear. You know, she needs mental help. She needs to be heard. She needs to finally deal with, in a healthy way, what she's gone through.
Anyone who's been involved in the criminal justice system, as long as I have, and anyone's a New York City person, you could tell that she's someone who's calling out for help.
And as the case will soon be heard by the courts, her lawyer wants to make one thing clear.
Her father was a monster, and living with a monster from the age of 3 is something that you just don't recover from without professional.
As the case moved toward trial, two competing narratives emerged, and they couldn't have been more different. Bridget's defense team argued this wasn't about revenge. Her motive, they said, was protection, an attempt to physically remove her father's ability to harm another child, specifically her young niece, whom she believed was in danger. In this framing, Bridget was a survivor pushed past her breaking point by a system that had already told her there was no legal path left to hold her father accountable. Prosecutors saw it differently. They pointed to details that suggested planning rather than a spontaneous act of self-defense. Scalpels purchased weeks in advance. A videotaped statement recorded days before the killing. The calculated act of burning evidence and packing a getaway bag. To the prosecution, these weren't the actions of someone caught in a sudden panic. They argued these were the actions of someone who had, to some degree, planned to hurt her father before that day ever arrived. And then there was the family itself, which fractured publicly and painfully. Carlene stood by her sister, corroborating the abuse allegations with her own account. Other relatives went the opposite direction, publicly casting doubt on the abuse claims entirely, with some suggesting that even if something had happened, Bridget had had years as an adult to report it through proper channels rather than take matters into her own hands. It's worth sitting with that disagreement for a moment, because it's not unique to this case. Family denial in the face of abuse allegations, especially when the accused is a respected, successful figure in the community, is one of the most common and painful patterns in cases like this one. It's also one of the reasons that Pastor Bridget's mother approached years earlier reportedly chose to do nothing.
As they left court, Harris's family cast doubt that her father abused her.
I don't think her father molested her. Even if he molested her, she had all rights, all many years to get up and do something.
At trial in September of 2009, Bridget testified in her own defense. She spoke about researching the Bobbitt case. She reiterated that her goal was never simply revenge. It was to stop what she believed was about to happen to her niece. The jury deliberated and ultimately rejected the most serious charges against her. Instead of murder, they convicted her of the lesser offense of second-degree manslaughter. One juror later explained that none of them felt she deserved a murder conviction, given everything they'd heard. What happened after the verdict is, in many ways, the most unusual part of this entire case. 7 jurors, people who had just convicted Bridget of killing her own father, wrote personal letters to the sentencing judge asking for leniency. Some attended the sentencing in person to advocate for her directly. Their reasoning wasn't that the killing was justified. It was that the years of documented trauma leading up to it deserved to weigh heavily on the punishment. They had heard testimony about beatings, about the pepper sauce incident, about a childhood defined by abandonment and abuse across multiple homes and multiple continents. Despite these letters, Judge Arthur Cooperman sentenced Bridget to 5 to 15 years in prison. With time already served since her arrest, she would become eligible for parole in roughly a year. The jurors' reaction was, by most accounts, genuine shock and disappointment. Several had believed, based on their understanding of the process, that their letters might result in her being released with time served. Instead, she faced years more behind bars. If you're an average juror, convicting someone and then personally advocating to the judge for their release is almost unheard of. It tells you something about just how compelling and how disturbing the testimony in this trial must have been.
She was tortured. She was beaten until she had open wounds, and her family made her get red hot pepper and stick it in the wounds, stick it in every orifice of her body. You know, they say you do the crime, you have to do the time. Unfortunately for Bridget, it was the other way around. She's been doing time until she did the crime.
A sympathetic jury convicted Harris of manslaughter, but they urged the judge to show leniency given the horrific past they heard on the stand. On Friday, the judge sentenced her to 5 to 15 years. With 27 months already spent behind bars, she'll be eligible for parole in about a year.
I am very upset about it. I felt she should be left free. I felt like she had enough. She's been abused all her life, and it's time for her to be able to get a fair share in life.
Sexual. Years of torture, years of abuse, she says, at the hands of her father.
I would get hit with anything from canes to fists, belts.
A number of people called him a monster.
Yeah.
Would you call him that?
That's a pretty accurate description. It was always pain and loneliness, always wanting to run away, never having the courage to run away.
Consider giving Bridget Harris the lowest possible sentence.
Judge, please be lenient.
8 jurors wrote letters on her behalf. 4 attended the sentencing. Her lawyer moved as well, handled her case for free.
Their reaction immediately after the verdict, they surrounded me on the courthouse steps and just said, please make sure Bridget gets the help she needs from a psychological point of view. And I said, fine, I will when she gets out of jail. And they were very surprised that she was going to go to jail. And they volunteered to do whatever they could to prevent that from happening.
Now they've kept their word to help her to be released from prison as early as the law will allow.
She made her mistake.
The stuff she had went through all her life from a little girl, I just figured she needed a break in life.
I just wanted to help her. I mean, throughout her life, she hasn't really had anyone that helped her, so.
Miss Harris just needs a chance to start over.
Looking back now, knowing what you're facing, hard time, would you have done this?
It's not something that obviously was rational thinking, and no, I would find other means of trying to bring him to justice.
Still, her belief stands. If not stopped, abuse will go on.
If he's done it to you, he's going to do it to someone else.
Bridget Harris tells me she decided to take the violent action after seeing her father with her young nieces on his lap. She says she believed he was planning to move the children out of the country to live with him and just wouldn't let that happen. Christine.
As far as early as the law will allow, when is the soonest she could possibly be released?
With time served in about 2 years.
At this point, we have to ask, do you think the sentence matched the crime? Or do you think the years of alleged abuse should have carried even more weight in the courtroom? This is one of those cases where reasonable people land in very different places. So tell us where you stand. Bridget Harris was released on parole on August 13th, 2012, after serving roughly 3 years. Rebuilding a life after a case like this isn't simple, and Bridget has been candid about how difficult it's been. She began working with an advocacy group supporting survivors of family violence, using her own story to try to help others navigate similar trauma. She also took ordinary jobs to support herself, delivering food and volunteering with an organization that redistributes surplus food from restaurants and bakeries to shelters and food banks around New York City. But she's also spoken openly about how hard reintegration has been. In her own words, she described being turned away from job opportunities once employers learned about her past. Including a delivery job, she was ultimately denied after providing character references and explaining her history. She's described a broader sense of rejection. Family members who no longer speak to her, strangers who are wary of her, a feeling that even after serving her sentence, society continues to hand out its own unofficial punishment. Her message to others who have survived abuse has remained consistent, that the guilt of what was done to you does not belong to you, and that the abuse itself is never the victim's fault, even when processing it as a child feels confusing and overwhelming. There's no version of this story that ends cleanly. A man is dead, a family is permanently divided, with some members believing he was a monster and others refusing to accept that possibility. A woman spent years in prison for stopping the abuse in the only way she felt was left available to her, and came home to a world that, in many ways, still hasn't fully forgiven her for it. What makes this case so difficult isn't just the violence of that day in July of 2007. It's everything that came before it. Decades of documented instability, alleged abuse, and a community, a pastor, and a legal system that each had opportunities to intervene and, according to the record, failed to do so. Bridget Harris's case forces an uncomfortable question that true crime cases rarely resolve neatly. What do we owe someone the system has already failed once they take justice into their own hands? Is it mercy? Is it accountability? Is it both, held in tension, the way that jury seemed to understand it when they convicted her and then begged for her freedom in the same breath? There's no clean answer. Maybe there isn't supposed to be one. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? Or are there still unanswered questions that deserve more attention? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story affected you the way it affected us, don't forget to subscribe because True Crime Folder is just getting started. If you or someone you know has experienced abuse, support is available through the National Sexual Assault Hotline and other advocacy organizations. You are not alone, and it is never your fault.